The person you love is crying with happiness right now because you finally did what they've been why. Something shifted in the quietest moment of their day, and for a few seconds, the person you love simply couldn't hold the emotion back anymore. They stood there staring at something they had almost stopped hoping for, a decision, a gesture, a change they had been waiting on far longer than you realized. Their eyes filled, but this time there was no sadness behind those tears. It was relief. It was happiness. It was the overwhelming feeling of finally being seen. And the most surprising part is this: you were the reason it happened. Something you finally did, something that may have felt small or ordinary to you, reached them in a place words never could. They may have replayed that moment several times already, trying to understand why it affected them so deeply. But there was a reason. They had been waiting for a sign that your heart was moving in the same direction as theirs. For a long time, they wondered whether you truly understood what they were trying to communicate without saying everything directly. Maybe they pulled back at times, not because they stopped caring, but because they were afraid of hoping too much. They noticed the little things, the way you responded, the way you became more intentional, the way you stopped doing something that had quietly created distance between you. And then, suddenly, you did the one thing they had been waiting to see. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand announcement. It may have been a simple message, a choice, an honest reaction, or even the way you finally showed them that you weren't walking away. But to them, it carried enormous meaning. Imagine them reading your words again in a quiet room, placing their phone down, taking a deep breath, and smiling through tears because something inside them finally whispered, "They understand." There's one detail you haven't noticed yet. They weren't waiting for perfection from you. They were waiting for proof that your feelings were real. And now, something is changing in the space between you. The emotional distance that once felt impossible to explain is beginning to soften, because your recent action gave them something they desperately needed: clarity. They don't have to keep guessing anymore. They don't have to wonder whether they matter to you. Somewhere inside, a decision has already begun forming, and it is more emotional than you might expect. They are not simply happy about what you did, they're happy because of what it represents for the future they secretly imagined with you. Their tears are carrying a message they haven't said out loud yet. And if you stay with this, you'll understand why that moment meant so much, what they are now preparing to say, and why the next conversation between you could reveal something they've been holding inside for far longer than you ever knew. Something happened after they finally let those tears fall that they never expected themselves to admit. They smiled, wiped their face, and then sat quietly for a moment as if they needed to make sure the feeling was real. The room around them hadn't changed. The night was still. Their phone was still in their hand. But something inside them had completely shifted. For so long, they had been protecting their heart by pretending they didn't need reassurance. They told themselves they could wait, that they shouldn't expect too much, that maybe you would eventually understand without them having to explain everything. But what you finally did broke through that wall. It showed them that you had been paying attention. And suddenly, all those moments when they questioned whether you cared began to look different. They remembered your smallest efforts. The pause before you answered. The change in your behavior. The decision you made when nobody was forcing you to make it. And that's when the tears came again, not because they were hurt, but because they realized they hadn't been waiting for nothing. There's another layer to this that makes their happiness even more meaningful. They weren't only waiting for you to do something, they were waiting to see who you would become when the moment finally arrived. They needed to know whether your actions would match the feelings you had shown them before. And now they have their answer. Somewhere along the way, you made a choice that told them, without a long explanation, "You matter to me." That message landed deeper than you realize. They may have even imagined how different things could be from this point forward. A conversation without defensiveness. A relationship without constant uncertainty. A future where both of you can finally stop guessing and start building. And here's what makes this moment so powerful: they are not celebrating because everything is suddenly perfect. They're emotional because they finally believe something genuine can grow from here. If this story is touching something personal in your heart, you can share it with someone who needs a little hope today, or leave a comment about the moment you realized someone truly cared about you. But don't move past this next part too quickly, because their reaction tells you something important about what comes next. After the happiness settled, they began thinking about one question they had been too nervous to ask before. They wondered whether your recent decision was only a single moment, or whether it was the beginning of something much bigger. That question stayed with them long after the tears dried. They looked back at everything that had happened between you and suddenly noticed a pattern. The misunderstandings. The silence. The moments when timing seemed wrong. The times when one of you wanted to speak but didn't know how. None of those moments erased the connection. They simply delayed the conversation that now feels impossible to avoid. And tonight, while you may be wondering what their silence means, they could be preparing themselves to finally say what they've been holding back. Because the thing they have been waiting for wasn't just your action. They were waiting for the courage to respond to it. Something about the way they looked at your recent decision made them realize they had been holding on to an old version of your relationship for too long. They had been measuring every new moment against the disappointments of the past, quietly wondering if things would ever feel different. But this time, they couldn't dismiss what happened. They noticed the sincerity behind it. They noticed that you didn't need applause, attention, or recognition for what you did. You simply did it because, somewhere inside, you finally understood what mattered. That realization hit them unexpectedly. They sat there remembering conversations you both had almost forgotten, little promises that were never fully explained, and moments when they had wanted to tell you exactly what they needed but couldn't find the right words. Now they weren't crying because they felt lost. They were crying because, for the first time, they felt understood without having to explain every piece of their heart. And then came the moment they had been avoiding. They opened the conversation again. Maybe they typed something, deleted it, typed it again, and stared at the screen for several minutes. Their heart was telling them to be honest, while their mind kept asking them to be careful. They knew one message could change the emotional atmosphere between you. So they chose their words slowly. Not dramatic words. Not a perfect speech. Just something honest. Something that carried the weight of everything they hadn't been able to say before. They wanted you to know that what you did mattered more than you realized. They wanted to tell you that it gave them confidence to stop pretending they were unaffected. And there was one sentence sitting behind everything they were trying to express: they had been waiting for you to show them that choosing each other was still possible. But before they could send it, they paused. Because there was something else they needed to admit first. They realized their happiness wasn't only about what you had done today. It was about what your decision allowed them to believe about tomorrow. Suddenly, they could picture ordinary moments that once felt impossible, a peaceful conversation, laughing together without tension, making plans without wondering whether everything would disappear again. It wasn't some unrealistic fantasy. It was the simple kind of closeness they had wanted all along. And that is why their emotions became so strong. You didn't just give them a moment of happiness, you gave them permission to hope again. But here's where the story takes a turn, because while they were quietly celebrating what you had finally done, they were also preparing to reveal something of their own. Something they've been keeping private because they weren't sure how you'd react. And when they finally tell you why they've been waiting this long, you may realize that the person you love wasn't simply waiting for an action from you. They were waiting for you to prove that the door between your hearts was never truly closed. Something changed in their expression the moment they decided they were finally going to tell you the truth. The hesitation disappeared. Their shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in a long while, they weren't rehearsing every possible outcome in their mind. They had spent so much time wondering whether you would understand them that they had forgotten what it felt like to simply be honest. But your recent choice gave them a strange kind of confidence. It told them that they didn't have to hide behind silence anymore. So they began thinking about the words they wanted to say. Not a dramatic confession. Not an emotional performance. Just the truth. They wanted to tell you that there had been countless moments when they almost reached out, almost explained themselves, almost admitted how deeply they cared. But something always stopped them. Pride. Timing. Uncertainty. And now they could finally see that waiting forever wasn't protecting their heart, it was keeping the person they loved from knowing what was actually inside it. Then they remembered one particular moment between you. It might have seemed insignificant when it happened, but they remembered every detail, the setting, the expression on your face, even the silence that followed. That was the moment they first realized their feelings weren't temporary. They tried to convince themselves it would pass. They told themselves they were simply attached to the memories. But every time they imagined their life moving forward without you, something felt incomplete. They never told you that. Instead, they carried it quietly while watching for signs that you might feel the same. And when you finally did what they had been hoping you would do, all those hidden emotions came rushing back at once. Suddenly, the waiting made sense. The tears made sense. The smile they couldn't hide made sense. If you've ever experienced a moment when someone's smallest action suddenly meant everything to you, you already understand why this affected them so deeply. And if this message reminds you of someone special, feel free to share it with them or leave a comment. Sometimes one honest sentence can say what months of silence couldn't. But there's still one piece of this story they haven't revealed. After deciding to be honest, they didn't immediately contact you. Instead, they did something unexpected. They began preparing themselves for the possibility that you might finally ask the question they've been hoping to hear. They imagined the conversation from beginning to end. What would they say first? Would their voice shake? Would they finally admit how much they missed you? Would they tell you how many times they almost gave up? And then they realized something that brought tears to their eyes all over again. They weren't afraid of telling you anymore. They were afraid of how much relief they would feel once everything was finally out in the open. Because your action had already answered the question they had carried for so long, do I still matter to you? Now the only question remaining is whether they're ready to tell you exactly what that answer has awakened inside them. Something unexpected happened when they finally stopped trying to control what they felt. Instead of analyzing every message, every pause, and every little detail, they simply let themselves feel happy. And that was new for them. They had become so accustomed to protecting their heart that genuine hope almost felt unfamiliar. They looked at your recent action again and realized why it had affected them so strongly. You hadn't just done something they wanted. You had done something that showed growth. You had responded differently. You had chosen differently. And that difference told them that the connection between you wasn't trapped in the same old cycle. For the first time, they could look forward without constantly looking over their shoulder. They could imagine the two of you having a conversation where neither person needed to defend themselves or hide behind carefully chosen words. And somewhere in that quiet realization, they understood that their tears weren't really about the past anymore. They were about the possibility of finally leaving the past where it belonged. Then they did something almost symbolic. They went back through old messages, photos, or memories they had kept tucked away, expecting to feel the ache they usually felt. But this time, something was different. Instead of focusing on what went wrong, they noticed how much had changed. They noticed how both of you had grown. They remembered the moments that made them laugh, the conversations that stayed with them long after they ended, and the times when your presence made an ordinary day feel strangely important. They realized they had been carrying those memories not because they were stuck in the past, but because they still believed the connection meant something. Your recent decision confirmed that belief. And now they were beginning to understand what they'd actually been waiting for all along, not some perfect moment, not some dramatic declaration, but evidence that the emotional door was still open. That realization gave them courage. Their fingers hovered over the screen again. This time, they didn't delete what they wrote. And what they were about to say wasn't what you might expect. They weren't preparing to ask for an apology. They weren't preparing to remind you of everything that had happened before. They wanted to tell you something much simpler, and much more vulnerable. They wanted you to know how deeply your choice had affected them. They wanted to admit that there were nights when they wondered whether you would ever understand what they were silently asking for. They wanted to tell you that they had nearly convinced themselves to stop hoping. And then you changed one thing. One decision. One action. One unmistakable sign. Now they were sitting there with a message ready, staring at the send button while their heart raced. They knew that once they pressed it, there would be no hiding behind uncertainty anymore. And just before they finally sent it, they noticed something that made them smile through another wave of happy tears, because they suddenly realized you may have been waiting for the exact same conversation. Something about that message made their entire body go still. They read it once, then again, as if the words might change if they looked away. For months, they had imagined what it would feel like to finally receive a clear sign from you, but imagination hadn't prepared them for the reality of it. Their eyes moved slowly across the screen, and a quiet smile appeared before they even realized they were smiling. There was no confusion this time. No hidden meaning they needed to decode. Your action had spoken clearly enough. And suddenly, they understood why they had felt so emotional earlier. They weren't simply happy that you had done what they wanted. They were relieved because they no longer had to wonder whether they had been alone in their feelings. The answer was right there in front of them. Still, they knew one thing remained unfinished. A message could open a door, but it couldn't tell the whole story. Somewhere beyond that screen was a conversation neither of you could keep postponing. So they began imagining what would happen when you finally spoke face to face. They pictured your expression when they told you everything they had been holding inside. They wondered if you'd be surprised by how long they had cared, how many times they had almost confessed, and how often they had chosen silence simply because they were afraid of changing what already existed between you. But now their fear was losing its power. Your recent decision had given them something stronger than fear. Certainty that honesty was worth the risk. They wanted to tell you about the moments when they missed you but refused to reach out. They wanted to explain why they sometimes seemed distant when, internally, they were feeling the exact opposite. And most importantly, they wanted you to understand that their waiting was never about demanding something from you. It was about hoping that one day you would willingly choose the same direction. Now that you had, they didn't want to waste another moment pretending it didn't matter. There's also a beautiful detail they haven't told you yet. While they were thinking about what to say, they realized the person they had been waiting for wasn't some perfect version of you. It was simply you, the version who finally decided to act from the heart instead of fear. That distinction changed everything. They didn't need a flawless relationship. They needed two people willing to be honest when things became complicated. Two people willing to communicate instead of assuming. Two people willing to make room for each other's feelings instead of hiding them. And for the first time, they could imagine that kind of connection becoming real. Their hand moved toward the phone again, but this time there was no hesitation. They were ready. They were ready to tell you exactly what your decision meant to them, exactly what they had been waiting for, and exactly why those tears of happiness appeared in the first place. But when the conversation finally begins, there is one sentence they plan to say that could completely change the way you understand everything they've done until now. Something in them finally settled when they realized they didn't need another sign. They had already received the one they'd been waiting for, and now the only thing left was to stop hiding behind hesitation. They looked at the words on the screen one more time, took a slow breath, and imagined what it would feel like to finally tell you the truth without editing themselves. For so long, they had carefully protected every vulnerable part of their heart. They'd say half of what they meant, then change the subject. They'd miss you, but pretend they were busy. They'd want to reach out, then convince themselves you probably didn't want to hear from them. But your recent choice disrupted that pattern completely. It showed them that sometimes love doesn't need a perfect speech. Sometimes one sincere action can say what hundreds of conversations couldn't. And as they sat there with tears still lingering in their eyes, they understood something powerful. They weren't crying because they finally got what they wanted. They were crying because they finally felt safe enough to believe it could last. Then came the conversation they'd been imagining. It didn't begin with a dramatic declaration. It started quietly, almost cautiously. A simple question. A pause. Then another S.